Hey everyone, I'm Michelle Yehi Lee, reporter at the Washington Post and president of the Asian American Journalists Association. Thank you for joining us for today's discussion on the Asian American Pacific Islander community and the 2020 election. Asian Americans are the fastest growing racial group in the United States. We've made significant strides in civic and political engagement over the years, including an increase in the number of AAPI elected officials across the country and an increase in the number of local and state races where AAPIs make up the margin of victory. But we have a long way to go. And it's so important to have AAPI reporters covering the growing influence of our community. I'm thrilled to have Matt, NIDHI, Alex, and Ben here tonight. They are must-follow reporters who have covered the 2020 campaign closely, documenting the diversity in the Democratic presidential field, as well as the importance of the AAPI electorate. And now I would like to introduce the moderator for today's session, campaign embed for NBC News, Ben Pugh.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, Michelle. Hello all, and welcome to another Reporting While Asian plenary. Today, we're going to be talking about the growing strength of the AAPI electorate and what it was like to be an AAPI reporter on the road for the 2020 presidential campaign. There were many extraordinary talented AAPI political reporters who followed the presidential primary, and we are currently covering the general election, and there's so many of them out there, and we're lucky to have three of them with us here today. Alex Tin is a CBS campaign reporter covering Arizona, Nevada, and New Mexico for the 2020 election. Earlier, he covered the presidential caucus in his home state of Nevada and the presidential primaries in nearby California, Arizona, and Washington. Matt Stevens is a political reporter for the New York Times based in New York. Previously, he covered breaking news and wrote general assignment stories on the assignment desk. Before coming to the Times, he was a reporter for the Los Angeles Times. NIDHI Prakash covers the Biden campaign for BuzzFeed News. Before that, she worked on Capitol Hill and reported on federal agencies and broke news on the death toll in Puerto Rico from Hurricane Maria. She had previously worked in UK, Chile, and started a career in Australian public radio. My name is Ben Pugh. I'm a political campaign embed for NBC News, and I covered various presidential campaigns, including the campaigns of Senator Elizabeth Warren, Senator Cory Booker, and Andrew Yang. I also covered the Iowa and Nevada caucuses, embedding in those states during the Democratic primary election. And so before we begin, if you are watching, please feel free to use the chat box to ask questions, and later in the program, we'll do our best to answer them. So we're going to go ahead and dive right into our questions here today. I first want to talk about covering the 2020 presidential election and what it was like doing that as an AAPI political reporter. So first, Alex, how did being of AAPI descent inform your reporting and the stories you pursued? And what kind of perceptions about your identity did you face while on the trail?
Well, thanks for the question, Ben. It was interesting because the state that I was focused on, there were the four big early states everyone was covering, Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, and South Carolina. And of the four of them, Nevada had by far the largest AAPI electorate. And, just even when you look at the country overall, when you're thinking about states that have really influential AAPI electorates, I mean, you've got Hawaii, which I think is in like around 40%. You've got California, which is maybe 14%. And then it's Nevada, which is 8%. So of the four early states, as well as of the whole nation, when you're thinking about places where the AAPI community has really made a difference in elections, it was Nevada. And having both grown up in Nevada and being able to return and report on Nevada, I think gave me an interesting perspective in understanding kind of the nuances on what that community looked like, the places where political activity happened in that community. And also, and we can talk more about this later, but a healthy dose of skepticism when it comes to how both campaigns approach those communities, and also how those communities within themselves, see each other, and see each other at the ballot box. And how those cleavages look a lot different than, somebody who maybe just is parachuting in and is saying, great, this campaign has an office in the local Chinatown of Las Vegas, when that much of the AAPI community in Nevada, like everywhere else, is much more diverse and stretches way beyond those boundaries.
Of course. And then now I'm going to ask NIDHI as well. You are a South Asian descent. I want to ask you, there were several presidential candidates who had South Asian descent. And so what kind of perceptions and your own background helped affect the way that you did your reporting?
I mean, I think it's a really interesting question, and I feel like The way that it really kind of influenced my reporting was that as a woman of color out there in the field, and as a woman of color considering what's really at stake in this election, and what these various candidates were promising, not only explicitly but also by virtue of their identities, that's something that I think that reporters of color can center a lot more kind of easily, naturally. That's something that is easily at the forefront of our minds. And that's something that I tried to center in my coverage, certainly, in terms of specifically how they were speaking to communities, how they were approaching their campaigning, but also, I guess, in terms of what promises they were making to various communities of color. And, just kind of trying to hold people accountable to that, I think, is a big part of that. So I do think that, definitely looking at the AAPI electorates around the country and candidates who also were in that category, but also thinking about it more kind of holistically as a reporter of color and a woman of color, and being really aware of, the impact of this whole process on different communities of color around the country, I think was a big part of what I was trying to achieve with the coverage. I mean, I think being on the trail, some of the things that I was able to pick up on were definitely different. There was one particular incident in Iowa that I remember very clearly after Kamala Harris dropped out. And I was on this kind of press bus with other Biden reporters. And I think everyone else on that bus was white. And we'd go into, the Biden events and talk to voters on the ground, again, in Iowa, majority white. And every single person I spoke to that day voluntarily said, without me bringing it up, I'm so sorry that Kamala Harris dropped out. I was, really behind her. I was hoping she would win. Right. So I got back on the bus and I was sort of did anyone else? I mean, is this something that was coming up for everybody else? Apparently, none of the white reporters on the bus were getting that from the voters at all. So it's just, I think there are just things that, by virtue of who we are, that some of the perceptions that we can kind of pick up, and some of the nuances about even white electorates that we sort of come around to.
Yeah, for sure. And then that transitions perfectly to another question. So for Matt, you were prominently covering Andrew Yang for a while during the Democratic presidential primary. I want to ask you about, how, of being AAPI descent, was it for you to cover that particular campaign?
Yeah, Ben, it's great to talk to you about this because you were out there too. But I think being Asian American and covering this Asian American candidate obviously blended together in huge ways, right? And I guess I would just share the quick story that, I would get asked actually by folks all the time whether I had selected to or volunteered to cover Yang because I was Asian American. And in fact, that couldn't be farther from the truth. I, of course, was intrigued by the fact that he was Asian American. And I remember the very first time I saw him was out at a National Action Network event. So that's the Reverend Al Sharpton's group. He was here in New York, and he was addressing a group of mostly Black people. And he he tried to use a version of his campaign slogan. This was still pretty early on, when he said something like, you meaning Black people, all bring the moral authority, I will bring the math. And as an Asian American, that struck me like a hammer. And it was the first precursor of starting to think of, wow, this guy is thinking about race and using Asian stereotypes on the campaign trail in really, you could say, interesting ways. Brought that back to the newsroom, and we did a story early on about that and about the other Asian American candidates in the race. And I think that's actually one of the best arguments for diversity in the newsroom. I think certainly many folks could have been in that room and understood that was an odd thing for him to say, but I'm not sure that everyone would have taken that back and said, okay, we need to do a story, and started looking at that in a more serious way that would lead to me covering him for months to come.
Yeah. No, I want to turn to our big news on the 2020 front, which is that former Vice President Joe Biden has selected California Senator Kamala Harris to be his running mate. NIDHI, based on your reporting for the Joe Biden team, and you covered Biden extensively, do you think that the AAPI vote was a factor in choosing Harris to be his running mate, and was energizing that electorate a possible consideration that Biden had to make?
So, I think that there are some key spots, as Alex was referring to in Nevada, certainly, which is, a pretty crucial state, where I think that really energizing the very, very quickly growing AAPI electorate in that state is something that the campaign would have been probably quite aware of. Having said that, I do think that, Kamala Harris in particular brought a lot of things to the table that probably were kind of a little bit more at the forefront of their thinking. Things like just having the name recognition of being, a senator on the national stage, and then also having this high profile political campaign that really also raised her profile even further. And I think that probably was the major factor here. Obviously, I can't say that definitively, but I do think that that's probably a larger part of the calculus. It's, it's obviously a benefit to the campaign if they can also energize AAPI voters around the country as a result of that. Certainly in talking to my family, everyone is very excited of the generations, I've gotten lots of text messages. So, it definitely is having an effect. Whether or not that was like a sort of a central consideration, I'm not sure.
Gotcha. And this is a perfect segue because we're talking about the effect for the Indian American community. Matt, this morning you actually published an article for the New York Times about the Indian American community cheering on Harris's selection. And one person said to you that they're, quote, feeling seen for the first time. And tell me what, voters you spoke to said about Harris's selection.
Yeah, of course, Ben, we didn't talk to everyone, and so I'm sure we didn't gather, the entire sort of parameters of the discussion. But the folks I did talk to talked a lot about just thinking of their immigrant parents and thinking of this question that they imagine that their parents have, which is, was it worth it to make all of these sacrifices and do this? And for them, just seeing Ms. Harris be elevated to this position sort of started to answer that question a little bit as sort of a resounding yes. I think folks were also thinking a lot about just the way in which Kamala Harris's mother's story resonates with their own, just sort of being in a community that, maybe you're new to and you feel a little out of place, and your mom is really, really smart and really great, but because she's got a little bit of an accent, people don't take her quite as seriously. I think people had some real resonance with that. And then I think also just the fact that Kamala is biracial was really powerful for people. I think they were encouraged and hopeful that America will have a little bit more of a nuanced view of race, and be able to understand that folks are not black or white or black or Asian. They can be black and Asian at the same time.
Now, Alex, I want to ask you about the down ballot races that this could influence. You're looking at a lot of Western states, some of which have higher Asian populations than others. Or Alex, is there anything on your radar that jumps out as you as being affected one way or the other by Harris? Are there any races that you kind of got an eye on?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I was talking with two of my colleagues, Jack Turman and Aaron Navarro, some fellow AAPIers at CBS, about kind of stories in this vein, kind of to move that ball forward. We read Matt's story, which is fantastic. And, kind of thinking about what are the next steps. You're the Biden campaign, you're the DNC, you're the D-TRIP or the SEC, which are the campaign arms of the Senate and the House. And how maybe you could leverage that part of her identity in ways that you couldn't with another candidate or with Joe Biden himself. And one of the things we had been talking about, and we'll see if it turns into a story, it's still in the early stages, but there are all of these interesting down ballot races, including in my quote unquote new beat of Arizona. In Arizona 6, there's Herald Tipernini, which is the Arizona 6th House candidate on the Democrat side. She identifies as South Asian, but there are candidates all over the place. Aaron was telling me that there are candidates in Texas and Georgia. But what's interesting is that you have candidates who very much have not leaned into that part of their identity, but it's undeniably a part of both how they're presenting themselves to voters and how voters perceive them. And so I think it's definitely something we're going to be on the lookout for. And I'm sure that we'll see more of once election day gets closer, to have those kinds of, synergies, to use a bit of a crass word, between the national campaign and finding ways to benefit these down ballot races that they see as so crucial. Because as we know, at the end of the day, if you're the Joe Biden campaign, being able to activate that part of your base to be able to elect House candidates that you want and Senate candidates that you want, just increase your leverage after election day to carry out your mandate. And so all of those things are interesting. All of those things are things we'll be looking out for.
Gotcha. And I also want to say, like, one of my colleagues, Deepa Shivaram, over at NBC News, and she's also one of the political campaign embeds for us. She was profiling an earlier a race in Texas, the Texas 22nd, I believe, where one of the candidates is South Asian descent, and the DESCC, I believe, is putting out ads in both Asian and in all kinds of Asian languages, and they've been seeing they're saying that they're hoping to see that a Kamala Harris pick will elevate that kind of race and get more voters excited about that. So that's going to be another interesting race to watch. So Matt, we're going to turn now to a topic that we talked a little bit about earlier. Let's talk about Andrew Yang. You know, Matt, you and I both covered Yang pretty extensively, and I can say with a high degree of certainty that Yang is now one of the highest profile Asian Americans to ever seek the offices of the presidency, the other being, of course, Senator Kamala Harris, at least for this cycle. Tell me what AAPI voters specifically told you about Yang's run for office.
Yeah, it was interesting, Ben. I mean, I think for a long first part of his run, folks just didn't know who he was. So it was just sort of trying to get introduced to him and then assess, okay, where does he stand on some of these racial issues, and how strongly does he feel about the AAPI community? And I will say, and I'd be curious to hear your perspective here later too, I mean, there were certainly moments where Andrew Yang and race came front and center. I think of Shane Gillis, the SNL comedian who used a racial slur to degrade him, and the moment later in the campaign when he was the only person of color on the debate stage. And I think what began to happen, this was a guy whose tagline was the opposite of Donald Trump is an Asian man who likes math. You start to see a little bit of a divide between how younger Asian Americans may have processed him and thought of him, and how older Asian Americans might have processed and thought about him. I think for some of the older generation, they were just extremely happy to see someone up there, that was a huge accomplishment. And I think for some of the younger folks, maybe they wanted him to be a little bit more progressive in his thinking about race. And so it was interesting to see sort of that ebb and flow and see how Andrew himself responded. I'd be curious to sort of hear what your take was.
Yeah, it's interesting. When we talk to a lot of AAPI voters specifically about Yang, a lot of them would say, like, I'm really excited that an Asian man is running for president. It's really an uplifting moment, and it's kind of a high degree of visibility. And he did enjoy some of that relative popularity in young Asian voters as well. That people were saying, wow, look at this guy. He's running for president. He's unapologetically Asian about it. However, there were a lot of elements of his campaign that people could not shake themselves from. They were like, oh, he's not taking it seriously. And it came a lot of through his joking manner, the way he conducted himself on the campaign trail. And there's not to say that there isn't a place for humor, at least on the campaign trail, but there were several moments that he really kind of towed the line between being professional and being what was quote unquote presidential, and what is some more relatable humor. We did a piece with my colleague Julia Jester about Yang's relatability, and as a result of him joking and making jokes about his Asian heritage and all these kinds of things, white voters thought it was funny. And a lot of times they would say, like, I don't see what the problem is. I don't really understand. It's just making fun of your own race. It's not a big problem. But we did speak to some academics and experts who were saying that, although that this is a way for him to become relatable to first-time voters who might be interested in his candidacy, what could be the long-term damage is harmful stereotypes against Asian Americans that are being perpetuated. And that is something that, people wanted to be aware of when they're looking at a candidate like that. And this is a good way to turn actually to another topic. Matt, the Democratic field was often touted as the most diverse group of any candidates ever. So what are some of the barriers that you saw facing candidates of Asian heritage. I'm talking about Hawaii Representative Tulsi Gabbard, California Senator Kamala Harris, and Mr. Andrew Yang himself. What were some of the positive encounters you saw between these candidates and communities of color that the public may not have seen? And what are the things that kind of like held them back?
Sure. And, Alex and folks who were out in the field in Nevada may be able to answer this question a little bit better too. But I think, and NIDHI also brought this up early. I mean, I think, Asian Americans make up, 5% of the voting population or something like that. And so when these candidates were assessing how to move forward politically, I'd be curious if any of you disagree with me, but I don't think Harris, Gabbard, or Yang sort of put their racial identity front and center and wanted to bang home the sort of AAPI vote. And to your point about Mr. Yang earlier, Ben, I think one of his tensions was his initial group of folks who liked him were working class folks, because he was on the Joe Rogan podcast and he was talking about the plight of truckers and what's going to happen in the future with automation. And so he was trying to sort of square the circle between, what I think in his gut is more progressive values and sort of having to appeal to a white audience in Iowa and elsewhere, right? And so because Asian Americans, in many cases, were not going to be able to swing an election for folks, I feel like that may have played a role in maybe having them not emphasize that. But I will also say that I think it was incredibly cool to be out at Dartmouth, I remember specifically, and a couple other colleges, and just see the enthusiasm and excitement from young Asian Americans looking up at people who looked like them. And you can just tell after you talk to them, after the stump speech, just how they're just gushing with things they want to say and experiences they want to share. And I think that just having these three folks, on this in this primary really gave something, gave a wide swath of folks someone who they could see themselves in a little bit.
Yeah, I totally hear that. And now, NIDHI, I also want to toss to you, what were some of the positive encounters that you saw between candidates and communities of color, people of color candidates? Why don't you go ahead and jump in here?
Yeah, I mean, I think something that was really fascinating this time around, and I think a direct effect of just how diverse this field of candidates was that I think maybe for the first time voters around the country, or maybe not for the first time, but very sort of vocally for the first time, voters around the country were sort of questioning the order of these primaries and the way that this system has worked for a long time. Certainly some of the candidates who were kind of forced to drop out before Iowa or just after raised this as an issue of just, why do some of these overwhelmingly white states have this kind of power in this process? And I think something that voters of color around the country were also sort of starting to question in a way that, it more actively played into this process this time around. Even in Iowa, I think some of the white voters on the ground in Iowa were sort of, I think felt the need to sort of end their status, as we're sort of doing a little bit of soul searching and genuinely kind of questioning their place in this, given sort of the increasingly diverse picture of the Democratic electorate in America. So I think, that was one interesting part of it. And I do think that people were encouraged to start thinking about that because they did see themselves in some of these candidates, probably most prominently for the first time at least. Maybe there have been some who have been less kind of well covered in the past. And that's also, I think, goes back to just having a more diverse field of reporters out there as well, who were able to kind of make sure that some of these candidates were being taken seriously to some extent. So it was just a really fascinating dynamic to see play out there.
Alex, what did you see in the dynamic out in Nevada?
Well, I just wanted to say, actually, I guess following off NIDHI's point, in addition to having a really diverse set of reporters that were out there and an increasingly diverse set of candidates from the Democrat side that were out there, I was surprised, at least in Nevada, when I first got there, about how many diverse staffers behind the scenes. I mean, for all the candidates I encountered, especially many who identified as AAPI, And it wasn't just that, say a campaign had hired a staffer who identified as AAPI to reach out to the AAPI community. I mean, you had just the state director of Cory Booker's campaign in Nevada. AAPI came from that background, but he was just the state director for the whole campaign in Nevada. The comms director for Joe Biden's campaign, Warren's team, Sanders' team. I mean, every campaign had staff and organizers and leaders in those campaigns who that community. And I think those are the kinds of things that are really robust and will have a lasting impact, at least on the Democrat, because you will have all these staff who have gained this valuable campaign experience working for these top candidates who are going to go off and work on the Hill or work for another campaign. And so, I'm sure that will be part of the conversation moving forward when it comes to thinking about what are these early states, because I'm sure Nevadans, for example, are going to be, right there at the front of the line saying, hey, look at all these reasons that Nevada can be really a proving ground for building that kind of infrastructure, diverse staff, diverse, what have you, going into the rest of their party.
Yeah, I can definitely say, as someone who was in Iowa for a long time, I can remember this one story when former HUD Secretary Julian Castro did an event, and he was there to tour something. Like he was there for like a shelter or something like that out in Sioux City. But what ended up happening was, because he, I suppose, dared to question the Iowa going first in the Democratic presidential primary process. And as we all know, how the caucuses turned out, he kind of felt vindicated about that. But while he was there, his shelter tour was completely derailed by angry Iowans who kind of were just like, Iowa has this political culture that cannot be replicated anywhere else. We've been doing this for such a long time, and we know how this process works, and we take it very, very seriously. Now, as a result of that, poor guy, he wasn't able really to do his event, but it also brought up a really interesting debate between a presidential candidate and voters who thought that they were going to lose their power in the political process. And so when, of course, the Nevada caucuses went out with mostly without a hitch, there was immediately like, we're going to get rid of the caucuses, and we should be first in the primary process. So I thought that was really interesting. Now, NIDHI, let's turn to you and let's talk about accountability journalism, specifically accountability to communities of color. There are going to be pieces that we write as reporters that hold their subjects' feet to the fire. And there was a story that you did about former Vice President Joe Biden's visit to Flint, Michigan. Walk me through the process of what you heard Biden say and what he didn't say, and how your story ended up taking form.
Sure. So it was an interesting evolution. So the first candidate to actually go through Flint this cycle was former HUD Secretary Julian Castro, and I actually pitched and managed to go along to cover his trip there. But really, what I was covering while I was out there was how the people of Flint feel about kind of being held up as this symbol every election cycle, despite sort of still suffering through this crisis that is still very much an ongoing thing in their lives, right? So these politicians kind of come through every 4 years, and then I think a lot of people there feel like they just sort of like disappear again, and they're left with their problems. So I had been there before for that trip and had spent a lot of time with real community leaders who actually have spent time trying to build their community back up, trying to push for actual change and actual investment in getting better infrastructure in there, in helping kids who are exposed to lead initially kind of deal with educational problems and health problems. So, I mean, I think that going into that trip with Biden there, I sort of knew ahead of time that it would be worth talking to some of those people who had already kind of been thinking a lot about the effect of these candidates coming through on their community. And so I reached out to some of my sources there who I had spoken to before, and just kind of got a sense of whether they'd been in touch with the Biden team. I mean, that's always, I think, one of the things that I think is very worthwhile doing when you're covering a community that you don't personally know yourself that well, is to try and understand who the leaders there are, who can actually talk you through, whether the people coming through are sort of like talking to them, whether there's communication, whether there's, a sense of respect for what people there are actually dealing with, whatever it might be. So I reached out to some of my sources there, and they said they had been talking to the Biden team. And at some point that they had just stopped kind of receiving communication from them, so they didn't know where the event was happening or what was going on that day. And I knew, like, I was traveling with the Biden press corps, so, you know, we were really there for about 5 hours or something total, right? So I, like, came in, I'd been talking to them beforehand, and that really was the way to kind of, like, get this story and this angle that I think would not have been possible if I had just landed and not done the research and not had the sources beforehand, right? So I think it's really worthwhile to try and make those connections. But essentially what happened was at the event, Biden kind of stood up and mentioned the water crisis for the first time about 6-7 minutes into his speech, and mentioned it really fleetingly in passing, and then moved right along to his regular stump speech. And it was just, I mean, I think particularly as a reporter who has spent time in that community, it really kind of stuck out to me. And some of the leaders who I'd been talking to beforehand had finally figured out where this event was and showed up. And after the event, were kind of just like, this was completely contrary to what we suggested that they do to be respectful to this community that is still suffering so much. And I think, like, particularly at that moment where it was very clear that Black Democrats were kind of powering Biden's campaign, that it was really important to think specifically about how his campaign was interacting with Black communities and issues that really mattered to them. So, I mean, I feel like that is the kind of story that just sort of allowed me to go a little bit further than what is easy to do on the campaign trail, which is just the kind of report back what he's saying, you know, which is like something I think we all strive to go a little bit beyond that, right? So this was one example of being able to do that, and I was really glad that we got that out there. It was also something that I had to kind of sell to my editors and sort of convince them that this was a story that was worthwhile. Like, obviously they want to do stories like this. I don't think it's a sort of a result of people not wanting to, but, you know, in the craziness of the campaign cycle, it's easy to lean on stories that they've kind of been familiar with before, in a way. So I think, you know, it was a good test case of kind of also convincing them that this was a worthwhile story for us to pursue.
Now, that's something that's interesting. You know, as a traveling reporter, you know, you've referenced your time on the press van, for example. A lot of times that there is a pressure perhaps to not report critically on a campaign because you don't want to be, you know, suddenly your name is mud and now you're not going to be able to speak to people. And this gets into what we call access journalism. And, you know, political reporters at certain outlets get offered interviews with candidates or with surrogates, and that's a media strategy to reach a wider net. Let's talk about access journalism. When you're a reporter of color, what are the different barriers you faced when working on the politics beat as an AAPI person? And, you know, specifically on this particular piece that you wrote about Biden's visit to Flint, Michigan, you know, what was the kind of response from the campaign, and what were the, you know, the effects of your own critical reporting?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is something that I think about a lot, you know, definitely in the context of campaign reporting, but even more broadly in the context of political reporting, because I do think that there is a fine balance, and, you know, all of us have to have that relationship with the campaign, and we want to try and, you know, cultivate people as sources and have the inside scoop on various things. I think it's been really important to me to work out how to kind of do that while not compromising the ability to be really critical, and also to kind of source my stories from outside the campaign itself. And that's where stories like this Flint story, I think, come into it, where it's not something that's coming directly out of, you know, a leak or a campaign source. It's actually about real people. And then as a result of that, kind of reflects back on, you know, really pushing the campaign. So in that particular instance, the campaign actually just didn't respond to it at all. There have been other stories which I've written that have been sort of, you know, calling them out on sort of making promises to various, you know, communities of color, you know, groups of color, and not really following that through in their policy. And on some of those stories, they have engaged. So it is kind of also an interesting thing to just sort of watch which stories they sort of deem worth really engaging on. And obviously, I think we all know that there's also like a little bit of a back channel where you know, get a call from, you know, one of the handlers who's kind of trying to like talk you around the story, or telling you, you know, trying to sort of explain their perspective on what would be the best story for them, essentially, right? So I think you want to be fair, obviously, like it's not a good policy to just kind of reflexively be overly critical, but also I think centering the people who actually will be impacted by their promises is a good way to think about it, I think.
For sure. And now I want to turn to Matt as well. There were several pieces that you wrote that were critical of the Yang campaign, but you covered him so extensively for the New York Times. I'm curious as to if your critical reporting ended up damaging your relationship with the candidate or with the campaign in any way, and kind of how you maneuvered around that, especially as a person of color.
Sure. I mean, I will say there was one particular piece toward what ended up being the end of the campaign where we looked into his just his background, and this guy was running to be president. So we wanted to understand sort of, was he good at running the nonprofit that he ran, or not so good? And there were some allegations that had come out from folks at different places he worked about them maybe being treated unfairly. So we wanted to do a piece on that. And I have to say, I mean, I think, of course, you get nervous about those sorts of pieces, and you want to be exceedingly fair. I think maybe the best thing that happened was we were all in New Hampshire for the New Hampshire primaries the morning that that piece ran, and I saw Mr. Yang in the hallway of the Marriott in the Starbucks line, and we just, chatted sort of like normal, said, hey, I was unfortunately in pajamas, which was not great. But, the story had landed, and we pressed on. And I think, in that case, just being really, really transparent with them about what we were going to write and sort of giving them the case, fact by fact, what we needed them to respond to, I think earned us some trust that, wasn't so successful in some ways with some folks on Twitter, but I think I think just sort of being transparent with folks and making sure that you're extremely fair can go a long way, because we continue to have good relationships with the campaign, months later.
Yeah, no, totally. I'm actually kind of in this same ballpark as well. We did a report about the Yang campaign in Iowa, and the kind of the background of that is that the essential story was that the Yang campaign was relying heavily on out-of-state people to participate in the Iowa caucuses. Now, of course, the Iowa caucuses are for Iowans only. You can sign up to be an observer, and you can make your short speech saying you should caucus for my candidate, but then you are not allowed to participate. And so the Yang campaign's usage of a lot of out-of-state people was particularly interesting. And so what we ended up doing is that we spoke to some folks who were involved in the campaign who corroborated our story. And then while I was on a 17-day bus tour with Yang across Iowa, I stopped every now and then to take a break, but I followed him very extensively. We were looking for people who had their math hats. All of the Yang campaign folks were wearing math hats, but the Iowa precinct, the caucus captains were wearing a math hat with a flag of Iowa stitched under the brim. And so it was very easy to identify those kind of folks for the campaign, because they were at these events and they were also wearing the memorabilia that really made them stand out. And so what I ended up doing is we have this information from the campaign, but there's not exactly from our campaign sources, but there's not a really good way to corroborate that because we can't speak to everybody. So what we did was I looked for every single precinct captain I could find who had that flag stitched under the brim, and I spoke to them. I said, hey, what's the deal? Are you from Iowa, or are you from out of state? And there was so many people that I spoke to who were like, nope, I'm not from here. I'm from out of state or whatever. And that was particularly revealing, I think, which was really interesting for me anyway. And I ended up speaking to one man who was from Kansas, and he said, oh yeah, I'm being a precinct captain in this particular city. And he had not been to that city a week before the caucuses. So that's kind of the genesis of our reporting. And of course, that story went out. I was still covering Yang up until the Iowa caucuses. They weren't happy for me for a day, but we moved on, and I was still following them, and there wasn't any problems. And I think that there's a line that political reporters, we have a duty and an obligation. If we come across some information, we vet it properly, we do the story, and then we go along with it. And I think that was a good example of, not letting personal opinions or anything like that get in the way. And I think that it kudos to every campaign that acts professionally when these kinds of stories do come out. Some of them can be pretty critical. I want to turn to a different topic now. So let's talk about the AAPI vote. Alex, you were stationed in Nevada for the Democratic primaries, right? And I often told people that nothing happened in the state without you knowing about it. Nevada was the first Western state to participate in the Democratic primary, the Western one, and the first state with a sizable Asian American population. What did you learn about the AAPI community out there and how presidential candidates and other campaigns reached out specifically to that community?
Well, thanks for the question. And actually, we can get to it later, but Ben, you did a great piece. I think one of the best pieces that I've seen kind of discussing some of the limitations to how the campaigns were trying to reach out to that community. But in Nevada, it was interesting because, and this has become much more, I think, of dramatic contrast for me as I've been kind of digging into Arizona politics. And that you see that there are other demographic groups. The Latino and Hispanic demographic group is probably the biggest contrast. But, you see it along gender lines, you see it along sexual orientation, you see other racial groups, ethnic groups, church groups, what have you, where, there is real political power there that's really organized and that it's really focused on a specific set of issues, that has staff, that has money, that has resources, and that is, broad-based, that has both grassroots support and top-down support, that has prominent political leaders who feel like they have a debt or an obligation to voice kind of the fact that they are trying to pay their respects and trying to do things towards those communities. And that difference between what you see in those communities and what you saw in the AAPI community really kind of highlights some of the limitations, some of the growing pains, and some of the room there still is to grow for the AAPI community in Nevada. And as I kind of mentioned at the beginning of the panel, the other thing is that in addition to there not being a consolidated, organized political power yet, I'm not saying there won't be, but there isn't yet, it's also not, a monolith. And obviously no demographic group is a monolith, no faith group is a monolith. But you don't have the kind of same consolidated support that you might see elsewhere around specific issues. And to that point, and like I said, Ben, you can talk a little more about this too, but when I would talk to voters and I talk about AAPI outreach, and you'd have campaigns touting the fact that they opened the office in Chinatown, right? Or the fact that they're printing, campaign mailers in Tagalog, the fact that they just brought in this very prominent Chinese American leader from California across the border to campaign in Nevada, and then you would sue somebody in the very large and, powerful Filipino American community that was in Nevada. They would say, that's great, but that has nothing to do with me. That's not who I am. That doesn't represent me. I don't see myself in them. I'm not against that, but that is not reaching out to me or my community or my interests. So in terms of reaching out to that community, I think just understanding those limitations has been really interesting to me.
Yeah, thank you for referencing my reporting on that. So one of the things that we did was when I spoke to a lot of Asian American leaders leading up to the Nevada caucuses, and one of them mentioned something that was really interesting to me, which I hadn't heard up until this point, and that was that the Nevada Democratic Party had made a big hubbub about printing caucus materials in Tagalog, which is a Filipino dialect. And I spoke to AAPI leaders in the Las Vegas area, and I think that maybe because of my AAPI heritage, they were willing to be a little bit more blunt, a little bit more frank with me. One of the things that I heard was that Filipino people in the United States and in Las Vegas speak English. So there was kind of like an eye rolling from the Filipino community where they were like, we already speak English. I don't understand why you need to print caucus materials in Tagalog. And one of the people I spoke to specifically called it a dog and pony show, which I thought was a very interesting, aspect to it, because up until this point, and I was doing a lot of reading about Nevada and the caucus process there, and a lot of, a fuss was made about the printing of Tagalog ballots, and the Filipino community in Las Vegas was just like, I don't even care. And so I thought that was really, really interesting, just on the ground reporting there. Now, Alex, I wanted to turn to another thing that you mentioned there, which was the disparate top-down AAPI political power in Nevada. You've expanded your scope to covering several other southwestern states. talk to me some about your observations about the political organizing by other groups outside of the AAPI community, and contrasting with perhaps Hispanic institutions and political figures in Arizona, and walk me through some of those differences.
Yeah, well, I had just one of the first things that I wanted to do when I focused on Arizona was focus on how both campaigns, the Trump campaign and the Biden campaign, were trying to reach out to the Hispanic and Latino community, because obviously that is not only just a hugely influential community in terms of raw numbers, but also in terms of kind of driving issues and driving discussions in Arizona. And I think what I found is that, there are some key challenges to reaching large segments of that population, which being a big one, but, there are all kinds of challenges that there are actual national organizations with a lot of money and resources that are trying to break through those challenges. And at the same time, when you look at the polling, there are broadly specific issues that are very important to that community, that are less important to other communities, and that candidates can do a lot by making sure to mention or discuss or address those issues from both sides. And you haven't really seen that as much from the campaigns towards the AAPI community. Obviously, that could change. We have an eternity until Election Day, right? But that's really been my experience in terms of seeing that contrast.
Gotcha. No, thank you so much. And so that ends my particular question. So now we're going to turn to some of the audience questions that you guys have provided that you want to hear us answer. So I'm going to go ahead and start this off. I'm going to throw this first to Matt. He is a California native, just like me. California moved up its primary to March this year, so it would have more of an impact. Given that California is among the most diverse states in the country, did that affect how various candidates conducted their campaign?
That's a good question. I would obviously welcome everybody else to weigh in on this too, but I just keep thinking back to the way that the primary played out, which was that South Carolina was the end-all be-all and totally flipped everything on its head and got us moving sort of in the direction that it got us moving. But I do think, my colleagues have done a huge amount of reporting, just sort of embedding with folks like the Sanders campaign and other for Tito Berni, and sort of the incredible sort of outreach that campaign in particular made to being really embedded into Latino communities up and down the state. I think certainly moving anything from way down in the calendar to Big Super Tuesday would be helpful, and I'd be curious for the folks who are a little bit closer out there if you have other thoughts. But the thing that just keeps coming back to me is, even if it did influence how the campaigns changed their behavior, the way it ended up, South Carolina was just hugely important.
Yeah. So I'm going to throw to Alex next first, and you covered California during the presidential primary. What was the impact of California moving its primary up?
Well, it's interesting because I remember when I first wrote about this, and it was pegged to this big California Democratic convention that candidates were all going to flock to, except for Joe Biden, but all the other candidates were planning on going there and talking to all the delegates and what have you. I remember back then, the big thing to tell me was, the main reason candidates ever come to California is just for fundraising. And so now they'll come out for a fundraiser, they'll tack on, like a quick event here or there, and then they'll fly out again. Maybe they'll head over to Nevada and then fly out. But what was interesting, and Matt talked a little bit about this, referencing his colleagues' reporting, is that you had the Sanders campaign and the Warren campaign to some extent, where they spent a lot of time and a lot of resources campaigning to these communities in California, organizing, hiring staff, building out office structures, even doing little things to try to get mentions in local press and what have you. And yet they weren't doing the kinds of big, high dollar closed door raisers that were driving some of the other candidates to be in town. And if anything, tip the scales in a way, because you would have it where, campaigns every minute of the day cost so much money for them, no matter where they are. And anytime they're not in the state that, is called Iowa or New Hampshire, there has to be a really good justification for it. And so when candidates would make the trip, many hours all the way out to California or Nevada and take that hit to their schedule in Iowa and it was hard for them to justify doing it and not doing a high dollar fundraiser. So in some ways, that really freed up candidates like Bernie Sanders, like Elizabeth Warren, to do a lot more time catering to these huge rallies and beautiful optics and on the ground campaigning, because they didn't have to devote part of the time they were in the States to also high dollar fundraisers. Now, obviously, that's totally different now. We've got the pandemic and what have you, but that really changed the dynamic back then, and it'll be interesting to see how it plays your elections.
NIDHI, I'm going to throw to you. What was the impact that you saw, at least on the Biden campaign, of California being moved up in the primary schedule?
Yeah, I guess I would just say really quickly that I think that something that I sort of thought I saw the effects of was that, as I think Alex alluded to, that California is one of the most expensive states in the country to campaign in. Like the media market is hugely expensive to buy TV ads in or to really spend any significant resources on, right? And I think something that a local Latino political leader in California said to me at one point, we were just chatting on background, but, without mentioning his name, he sort of said that, like, he's seen this cycle where campaigns, and I'm not speaking specifically about the Biden campaign here, but the campaigns tend to sort of talk it up, but then not really invest the resources in Latino communities in the same big way that they say they're going to, because, as he put it, in terms of turnout, that sometimes they've seen Latino voters not turn out as much as they would have liked to or that they expected to. And I mean, he was quite bitter about it. He was quite upset, understandably, that that's a reason that, communities can get written off. But he sort of said the way it was, just because you don't stick the landing, or just because someone doesn't stick the landing, is that a reason to sort of, write them off?
Gotcha. So I've got another question here from the audience. There are so many inputs to keeping up with the competition. How do you handle all the Twitter accounts instead of the campaign releases, not to mention the actual fake news from bots? How do you keep track? How do you not tweet decks, certain apps, trade secrets? First and foremost, I would recommend setting up Google Alerts. I like using TweetDeck. And that's, I used to have a Slack. Back when I was covering Elizabeth Warren, I had an automated Slack channel that would, instead of sending these long emails to my inbox, because I have so many already, the Slack for me was a good priority. And as a result, every time that a keyword was triggered, the Slack channel would automatically ping me and provide a link to that story. And that helped me kind of keep it, because I was like, oh, I'm going to pay more attention to Slack than I'm going to pay attention to email. Ultimately, however you do it is up to you, because I know that some people want to keep all of their kind of eggs in one basket. I'm going to throw to Alex, because if you follow Alex on Twitter, you'll know that he is the clearinghouse for press releases. He keeps on top of that. So I'm going to throw it to Alex.
Yeah, well, I think when it comes to like trade secrets, right? One of the things that I use, which I find really helpful, there's a bit of a learning curve there, is Feedly, Feedly. And there are a lot of different ways you can use it with like RSS feeds and stuff, but I love it because it just gives me a nice consolidated way to put a bunch of those Google alerts in one place, plus Twitter accounts I like to follow, plus press release sources that I try to keep tabs of. And I can just scroll through it, mark the things I want to keep for later, dump the stuff that I don't care about. In addition to that, one other thing that I thought was very helpful for me, and that is helpful, I think, for anybody, is just to have for yourself like a nice consolidated way to like sit down and digest a lot of information, take note of it, and then move on. So you're not always having that pressure of it hanging over your head. And so like developing that habit early, developing that habit before you're on the trail can be cool. I am personally a huge fan of Google Keep and Google Drive, but everyone has their own thing, OneNote and what have you. So.
Now, we have another question here. How do you judge when you're being played by a source? I'm always concerned that a source is misleading me to shape a version of the story that they prefer. Obviously, as campaign reporters, we deal with this all the time. And so I'm going to throw this to NIDHI first. What is something that you have to do to kind of make sure you're not being played?
I mean, I think just doing your due diligence, right, as you would with any reporting, to make sure that you're doing your research. And I think just thinking a little bit more broadly, right, like thinking about the context of why someone might be telling you something, where they might have gotten that information from, and just, basically getting as much backup for it as you can if it is something that you think is worth running with.
Gotcha. And then, Matt as well, like, you work for the New York Times. Obviously, I'm sure you get a lot of press releases in your inbox. What's a way to judge if you're being manipulated in some way?
Well, I guess on the two questions, the tools and then the manipulation.
For sure.
One of the tools that we have that I had not had before that is just helpful with breaking news in general is this data miner thing that just sort of like uses artificial intelligence to surface things all the time.
The tyranny of data miner.
Yeah, I mean, it rules your life, but it is like extremely helpful, right? And I will say, when I was fully on Yang for down the home stretch, I did just suck it up and put notifications on so that every time he tweeted, I saw. Obviously, creating sort of a separate Google inbox. I had a 2020 campaign email inbox, or tag, which I think I've seen a lot of folks tweet, so that you could just have all of those campaign emails in one place. And particularly sometimes the emails that the campaign sends out to donors sound and read different than the press releases they're sending out. So sort of separating those was helpful. And as far as just, how to make sure that you're not being played by a source, I mean, I think that is one of the skills we really develop as journalists, right? Is being able to sort of, assess, we know that many of the folks who are speaking to us in politics are trying to spin us. That's sort of like a base fundamental thing here, right? And so you've always got that guard up. And then I have just found that sort of, we all report in different ways. We all have different approaches. And the PR people, the campaign people, they all have their own ways too. And you start to learn, okay, this guy is a hard butt. And this guy is really genuine and truthful. And I can lean on him. And you assess those relationships and sort of make your judgments based on what you know about these people. And different people behave in different ways. I'll say that.
Matt, thank you for preventing yourself from swearing by calling someone a hard butt. I really appreciate that. So we're running out of time here. Thank you guys so much for your time. So we're going to do a quick rapid fire round. And so as you guys know, because of the pandemic, we're doing it like this. And for many of us as well, being on the road for 2020 is basically over. However, I'll be the first to say this. It's never too early to start thinking about 2024, which is probably triggering a lot of people right now. But that being said, for reporters out there who are thinking about getting on the road in the future, what is one essential tip for aspiring presidential political reporters? And I'm going to throw this to Matt first.
Well, we were talking offline. I think one of the most integral aspects of being on the trail is the food. And that can go well or not well, depending on where you are and what's available. So my tip would just be to find the person in your newsroom who has done this campaign trail thing before. That person probably knows all of the best places and all the most obscure parts of Iowa and New Hampshire, and just make sure that that person is sending you all of their recommendations sort of for wherever you are.
NIDHI, what's your tip?
I just say that this is a highly competitive area, obviously. There are so many of us, we're all switched on all the time, but there's so much room. So just think outside the box. Talk to people that no one else is talking to, think outside the campaign people. And there's just a whole world of stories out there that no one is telling. So I just think there's a lot of room.
Alex, what's your tip?
I think just as something that I needed to be told, and I'm so thankful somebody once told me, is just write as many, even though I'm in TV basically, right? So you think it's all about operating a camera and being in front of the camera, but writing is so important, and it's so hard to get good at it unless you're doing it a lot, you're doing it all the time, you're doing it in a way that makes you feel uncomfortable sometimes, you're doing it and getting feedback on it. You got to write as much as you can, whenever you can, about anything you can find, and put your hands on and get an editor in front of. So write. Even if you're not planning on going into that, because Ben, as you can attest, even all the TV embeds, at the end of the day, we had to write.
That is true. We write a lot. So for my tip, at least, is it's make it clear early that you want the job. I think that, a lot of people are very cringy. They're like, oh, I can't believe we're talking about 2024 right now. But I I actually spoke to Chuck Todd, who was the moderator of Meet the Press Daily for MSNBC, shortly after I was hired in December of 2016. I sat down with him, and very early on, I said, look, I want to be an embed in 2020. How do I get there? And that started the conversation off really, really early, really strong. I think that as political reporters, if you want this job, speak up for yourself and speak up early and often, especially as you get closer and closer to that time. And so with that, I want to thank everyone again for tuning into this panel, and I want to thank our great panelists for joining me today. We look forward to everyone's reporting on the 2020 campaign as we get closer to November. I also want to thank AAJ for planning this wildly successful AAJ Fest. It's been really, really great to just learn so much from all the different panelists. And I would encourage any of you watching, if you have your membership, then it needs to be renewed, or if you're just checking out AAJ Fest without a membership, please consider renewing so we continue to make programming like this possible way, way into the future. We have some more great programming tonight, including a cook-along live stream, game shows, and a session on U.S.-China tensions. So please stick around and have a great night. Thank you very much for coming. We'll see you all soon.